Hello everybody, please enjoy my group and I's A4 research presentation for Ecology 2060.
Our goal is to look at the long-term effects of secondary succession in an urban park, specifically Point Pleasant Park located in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, after Hurricane Juan devastated the area in 2003. Studies like Neely's in 2004, Burley's in 2008, Lepack's and Friedman's in 2010, and Turchin's in 2016 looked at how Hurricane Juan had affected Point Pleasant Park. We essentially are carrying on these studies by also looking at how the ecosystem has changed 22 years later. Other studies like Berg's in 2018 discuss wind and tree survivorships, and Sass's in 2018 discuss long-term influences of a disturbance to an ecosystem. With all this other literature to compare our data to, we have an interesting opportunity to show an in-depth analysis of how Point Pleasant Park's community and diversity has changed. Secondary succession occurs when the soil remains after an area has been destroyed by some act. In our case, it was Hurricane Juan. Because the soil remained, so did seed banks, which are just collections of seeds that are stored in the soil and then used to repopulate the ecosystem. This makes for a much faster recovery rate of the forest. Before colonization, the Mi'kmaq people named Point Pleasant Park Spirit Place, because it is where the Great Spirit Fire sat and whose spark gave birth to the 7 original families. The Mi'kmaq would come from all over the 7 days each year and celebrate the creation of their people. Point Pleasant Park's forest was old growth, meaning there was a large canopy that blocked sunlight from getting into the lower levels, so younger trees and smaller shrubs and ferns had a hard time living there. This is part of why Hurricane Juan devastated the area as much as it did, because there was no new growth to help block the winds. Another big player in the destruction of the was the shallow soil, which caused the trees to have a shallow root system. Our guiding question was, how is the forest changing due to secondary succession? And we believe that secondary succession is allowing biodiversity to increase and species richness and evenness to even out as the forest rebuilt itself. Our site is a 20-meter by 20-meter box that was divided into 4 groups, and it was one of the areas of Point Pleasant Park that was heavily impacted by Hurricane Juan. For our data, we looked at the diameter at breast height, known as DBH, of all trees within our site by measuring 4.5 feet from the ground up the trunk, then used the diameter tape to find the diameter of the trunk at that height. We then used either an online source like iNaturalist or a field guide provided to us to identify the species of tree. Next, we wanted to look at the percent cover of ground flora, so we randomly placed 3 quadrants inside each group and recorded everything we saw. Once again, using either iNaturalist or a field guide to identify the species. To decide where the quadrants went, we stood at the border of each group and threw a colored object over our shoulder to ensure randomness. Then we placed the wooden quadrant down using the colored object as our center. Once we were done, we threw the object again from where it was currently laying. Each group had this process done 3 times for a total of 12 sections of the site. Once we had the data, we wanted to look at total density, species richness, density of red spruce and red maple, and Shannon Diversity Index, which is a calculation that takes the species richness and evenness into account. Finally, we used regression analytics to analyze the data.
So one of the main reasons of this study is to address how the forest community has changed over time following the event of Hurricane Juan. So if we look at this graph here, the big takeaway is that the forest has been getting more diverse over time. Right after the hurricane, you can see that there were even a few instances that the Shannon Diversity Index was 0, which means there was no diversity. And as the years go by, we can see a steady uptrend in Shannon diversity, meaning that more species are coming back and the community is rebuilding. Recall that Shannon Diversity Index measures biodiversity in a community by accounting for both the number of species and their relative abundance. So an SDI of 0 means only one species is present and there's no diversity. So at first you get the fast opportunistic species that will rush in to disturbed areas. Then as conditions settle, other species, usually slow growing or more specialized, start to join in, and that mix of new and old species increases the forest's overall diversity. So the R-squared is only about 0.33, which tells us that time explains part of this trend, but it's likely including other ecological factors like competition, weather, and species interactions. So what does this mean going forward? As the forest moves closer to its climax community, so the most stable and mature version of the community following ecological succession, we would expect diversity to keep rising, but it will probably stabilize. It won't happen as quickly, as species that are best adapted to the environment end up shaping the long-term community. So overall, the forest is showing a healthy trajectory with increasing stability and complexity as it moves towards its long-term mature state, which is a great thing to see.
Another way we measured the park's change was through species richness, which is essentially the number of different species in a community. So looking at the graph, we can see that there was a general increase per 400 meters in 2005 compared to 2004. This metric is important for the experiment as it illustrates that the park is in the process of rebuilding itself and actively increasing its biodiversity. The R-squared value is around 0.58, meaning that there is a strong positive correlation between time and species richness, and that time can explain a good portion of species richness data. This increase can be attributed to multiple factors, such as microsite heterogeneity, which are the small variations in environmental conditions given a site. Sass et al.'s 2018 study found that microsite heterogeneity had a positive correlation with species richness. With Hurricane Juan, wind disturbance broke up the existing homogeneous forest structure, creating drastic change to the environmental conditions, which created more microhabitats and more possibilities for regeneration. Further, another factor would be the successional reset. Burley et al.'s 2004 study indicated that the hurricane wiped out 70% of the canopy. However, by having this disturbance, it altered resource and light availability, which led to a boom in shade-intolerant pioneer tree species, which rapidly recovered lost vegetation. Based on our data trends as well as ecological context, we can predict that in the next few years, species richness is expected to remain high rather than decline. In a climax community, the final stable stage where the ecosystem is self-sustaining, stand structure continues to change, but species richness is stabilized. This stability is supported by long-lasting microsite heterogeneity, which can persist 5 to 7 decades after disturbances like Hurricane Juan, suggesting long-term diversity. Lastly, the prolonged transitional stage provides the time essential for the processes of a species coexistence to play out, creating potential for species richness.
The secondary succession following Hurricane Juan led to a strong initial increase in red maple density, as seen in the top figure. This pattern reflects red maple's advantage in high sunlight environments. The extensive canopy loss caused by the hurricane created ideal conditions for an early successional species to establish and expand. This is in contrast with the lower figure. Red spruce density increased more gradually. As the canopy began to regenerate and light availability decreased, shade-tolerant species such as red spruce were better able to establish and persist beneath the recovering forest cover. This pattern follows the natural successional trajectory of Nova Scotia's coastal forests, where red spruce gradually replaces early successional hardwoods as shade levels rise and competitive pressures intensify. As Point Pleasant continues to recover, the total density figure provides important context for understanding how dominant species will change. As seen in this graph, total stem density increases as the forest fills in, competition increases, and self-thinning reduces crowded individuals. This marks the transition towards later successional stages. Red spruce is expected to increase relative dominance because it's a shade-tolerant climax species capable of thriving under low light conditions of a mature canopy. Whereas red maple density is expected to decline as reduced light and competitive exclusion limit its ability to regenerate alongside continued self-thinning. Ultimately, the forest is predicted to transition towards a stable, shade-tolerant red spruce hemlock community, typical of the regional climax forest.
Okay, so I've also just included a comparison photo here of before and after the hurricane, and about 20 years later on the right here. So you can see how much regrowth the forest has had over the years. But another thing these photos show us is what stage of succession the forest might be in now. So we look somewhere to be in the intermediate area of these two photos. So by looking at photos like this and knowing what the area looks like at different times, it really gives a good basis for prediction on what successional stage you might be in. Alright, so in conclusion, our data is suggesting that the forest at Point Pleasant Park is currently in mid-successional stage. Both the Shannon diversity and species richness are increasing, which tells us that the forest is recovering and moving towards a more stable climax community. So we're also seeing the typical successional shifts. Early successional species like the red maple are gradually being replaced by more shade-tolerant species such as the red spruce. However, because this is an urban park, factors like trampling, pollution, invasive species are going to slow its recovery. And finally, the Micmac traditional knowledge reminds us to look at the ecosystem as a whole. Their holistic approach could really help guide restoration and make the park more resilient in the long run if we can learn to blend cultural knowledge and modern science together. Of course, this presentation and research would not have been possible without the vast contributions of the Dalhousie staff and faculty, so a special thanks to all of you that contributed some valuable time towards the creation of this study. Thank you guys. And our references.